Welcome to Creepy, the best horror storyteller on YouTube.
Sarah had always been passionate about soccer. She loved everything about the game, the teamwork, the competition, and the feeling of scoring a goal. She had been playing since she was a little girl, and she dreamed of one day playing for the national team. When Sarah was 16 years old, she was invited to attend a training camp for the national youth team. The camp was located in a remote area of the country, and Sarah was excited to be there. She knew that this was her chance to impress the coaches and prove that she belonged on the team. Sarah arrived at the camp on a hot summer day. She was immediately struck by the isolation of the place. The camp was surrounded by dense forests, and the only sound was the chirping of birds. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine, but she quickly dismissed it as nervousness. Sarah met her teammates and coaches, and they began training immediately. The training was grueling, but Sarah loved it. She was determined to give it her all. One night, after a particularly long day of training, Sarah decided to go for a walk in the forest. She wanted to clear her head and enjoy the peace and quiet. Sarah walked for a while, until she came to a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a large tree. Sarah sat down at the base of the tree and closed her eyes. As Sarah sat there, she heard a noise behind her. She opened her eyes and saw a figure standing in the shadows. The figure was tall and thin, and it was wearing a long, black coat. Sarah stood up slowly. "Who's there?" she asked. The figure didn't answer. It just stared at Sarah with its cold, black eyes. Sarah took a step back. "Who are you?" she asked again. The figure still didn't answer. It just kept staring at her. Sarah turned and ran. She ran as fast as she could, but she could hear the figure's footsteps behind her. Sarah ran until she reached the camp. She burst into the dining hall, where her teammates and coaches were gathered. "What's wrong?" her coach asked. Sarah took a deep breath. "There's a man in the forest," she said. "He's following me." The coach and the other players looked at each other in concern. "We'll go and check it out," the coach said. The coach and a few of the other players went back into the forest. Sarah stayed behind with the other players. A few minutes later, the coach and the other players returned. They were all shaking their heads. "We couldn't find anyone," the coach said. Sarah looked at the coach in disbelief. "But I saw him," she said. "He was following me." The coach sighed. "Maybe you were just imagining things," he said. "It's been a long day." Sarah didn't believe him. She knew what she had seen. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the figure in the forest. She had a feeling that he was still out there, watching her. The next day, Sarah didn't go to training. She was too scared. She stayed in her dorm room all day, with the door locked. That night, Sarah had another nightmare. She was dreaming that she was running through the forest again, with the figure chasing her. She woke up in a cold sweat. Sarah knew that she couldn't stay at the camp any longer. She was too scared. She packed her bags and snuck out of the camp in the middle of the night. Sarah walked for hours until she reached the nearest road. She flagged down a car and asked for a ride to the nearest town. Sarah didn't look back. Sarah never returned to the training camp. She never saw the figure again, but she never forgot it. She knew that it was real, and she knew that it had been watching her. Sarah continued to play soccer, but she was never the same again. She always had a sense of unease, and she was always looking over her shoulder. She knew that the figure could be anywhere at any time. Sarah's story is a cautionary tale for all athletes. It is a reminder that there is always a risk when you train in remote or isolated areas. It is also a reminder that there are things in the world that we cannot explain and that we should always be aware of our surroundings. Sarah returned to her normal life after leaving the training camp, but she was never the same. She was constantly on edge, and she always felt like she was being watched. She had nightmares about the figure in the forest almost every night. Sarah started having strange things happen to her. She would hear footsteps behind her when there was no one there. She would find strange symbols carved into the trees near her house. And she would see the figure in the forest out of the corner of her eye. At first, Sarah tried to ignore the strange things that were happening to her. She told herself that she was just imagining things. But as the things got more and more disturbing, she couldn't deny it anymore. Something was wrong. One day, Sarah was walking home from school when she saw the figure in the forest. It was standing in the shadows, watching her. Sarah started to run, but the figure was faster. It chased her through the forest until she reached her house. Sarah burst into her house and slammed the door shut. She locked all the doors and windows, and she hid under her bed. She stayed there for hours, too scared to move. When Sarah finally came out from under her bed, she found a note on her pillow. The note said, "I'm watching you." Sarah was terrified. She didn't know what to do. She couldn't tell anyone about what was happening to her because they would think she was crazy. Sarah decided to start investigating the figure in the forest. She wanted to know who it was and why it was stalking her. Sarah went back to the training camp where she had seen the figure for the first time. She searched the forest for any clues, but she couldn't find anything. Sarah then went to the town library and researched the history of the area. She learned that the forest was once home to a cult that practiced dark rituals. The cult had been disbanded many years ago, but Sarah wondered if the figure in the forest was a member of the cult. Sarah decided to return to the forest at night. She knew that it was dangerous, but she was determined to find out more about the figure. Sarah walked through the forest for hours, but she didn't see anything. She was about to give up when she heard a noise behind her. She turned around and saw the figure standing in the shadows. The figure was closer this time. Sarah could see its pale skin and its sunken eyes. Sarah backed away slowly, but the figure followed her. Sarah turned and ran. She ran as fast as she could, but the figure was faster. It chased her through the forest until she reached a clearing. Sarah collapsed in the center of the clearing, exhausted. The figure stood over her, its cold, black eyes staring down at her. Sarah closed her eyes and waited for the end. But the end didn't come. Sarah opened her eyes and saw that the figure was gone. Sarah didn't know what to think. Had she just imagined the whole thing? Or had something saved her? Sarah stood up and walked slowly back to the edge of the forest. She looked back, but the figure was nowhere to be seen. Sarah never returned to the forest again. But she never forgot the figure. And she never forgot the feeling of its cold, black eyes staring down at her. Sarah knew that the figure was still out there, somewhere. And she knew that it was watching her. Sarah continued to live her life in fear after her encounter with the figure in the forest. She always felt like she was being watched, and she had nightmares about the figure almost every night. Sarah tried to talk to her parents about what was happening, but they didn't believe her. They thought she was just going through a phase. Sarah's friends started to notice her change in behavior. She was withdrawn and always seemed to be on edge. They tried to talk to her, but she refused to tell them what was wrong. Sarah's grades started to suffer, and she fell behind in her schoolwork. She couldn't concentrate on anything. Sarah's parents were worried about her, but they didn't know what to do. They took her to see a therapist, but the therapist couldn't help her. Sarah started to lose hope. She didn't know how much longer she could live in fear. One day, Sarah was walking home from school when she saw the figure again. It was standing in the shadows, watching her. Sarah knew that she couldn't run away anymore. She had to confront the figure. Sarah walked towards the figure. "Who are you?" she asked. The figure didn't answer. It just stared at her with its cold, black eyes. "What do you want from me?" Sarah asked. The figure still didn't answer. It just kept staring at her. Sarah took a deep breath. "I'm not afraid of you," she said. The figure smiled. It was a cold, cruel smile. "You should be," the figure said. The figure raised its hand, and Sarah felt a wave of energy wash over her. She collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Sarah woke up in a hospital bed. Her parents were sitting next to her. "What happened?" Sarah asked. "Someone found you unconscious in the park," her father said. "You've been in a coma for 2 days." Sarah looked around the hospital room. She didn't see the figure anywhere. "It's gone," Sarah said. Sarah's parents looked at her in confusion. "What's gone?" her mother asked. "The figure," Sarah said. "It's gone." Sarah's parents didn't believe her. They thought she was still delirious from her coma. But Sarah knew what she had seen. The figure was gone. Sarah never saw the figure again. But she knew that it was still out there, somewhere. And she knew that it would be back one day. Sarah lived the rest of her life in fear. She always looked over her shoulder, and she never felt truly safe. Sarah's story is a cautionary tale for all. It is a reminder that there are things in the world that we cannot explain, and that we should always be aware of our surroundings. It is also a reminder that even when things seem hopeless, there is always hope. Sarah survived her encounter with the figure, and she went on to live a full and happy life. But she never forgot the figure, and she never forgot the fear.
Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe for more similar horror stories.